Time was suspended in the Oval Office that October night in 1962. And the men who gathered there dreaded the instant time would mark off the seconds again. Only one of them is left to recall the events during that time in limbo. Only one whose presence history avoided recording and can talk about the truth of that night. A truth residing in that moment with those who lived it. For Erich Neumuth, German nobleman turned Luftwaffe pilot turned spy and secret presidential advisor, the clock on the Cuban Missile Crisis began ticking 25 years earlier in the back alleys and mean streets of Berlin. For President-elect John F. Kennedy, it began marking time on November 29, 1960, 24 days after his narrow win for president over Richard Nixon. It was 1961. A new administration, and according to John Kennedy, a new era was starting. Cuba and the Russians had been major issues in his campaign, and as Kennedy assumed his new role as president, key players assembled behind the scenes, players who would act out the political drama that turned those campaign issues into life and death issues. And while JFK, the principal in the drama, was sizing up the players, Erich Neumuth, CIA human intelligence officer and Russian expert, was behind the scenes in Europe. But before Erich would become a key player in the moment we call the Cuban Missile Crisis, it would take a series of 5 key meetings with the president. The Secret Service logs show nothing of his presence that first meeting in February 1961 in the little room off the Oval Office. But he didn't meet the president alone. Allen Dulles and J. Edgar Hoover escorted him in and stood by for hours as they drank Scotch whiskey, smoked cigars, and talked through the night. Erich was in Europe when the president was elected. Allen Dulles was in Belgium when he contacted the Russian expert.
I'd like to introduce you because the president asking everybody, who is Khrushchev? Who is the Russians? Eisenhower personally mentioned my name and advised the president, keep me on a list to be as advisor.
Just a month after Kennedy's inauguration, at Eisenhower's urging and with Allen Dulles orchestrating the contact, Erich was secretly ushered into the White House to prove his value to Kennedy. Erich's information was timely since the Soviet chairman Nikita Khrushchev had requested a June meeting in Vienna with Kennedy to test the feat of the new American president.
He didn't know nothing. What he knew, you could find in a book. His information was supplied by the embassy from Moscow, and the embassy people couldn't move around Moscow because there was being watched.
Kennedy knew his information about the Russians and Khrushchev was limited. He also knew he needed to prove himself a tough leader in the international arena by understanding his adversary. Erich was brought over in a special military plane from Germany.
Edgar Hoover was waiting for us on an airport.
Hoover warned Erich that once he was on U.S. soil, he was under the jurisdiction of the FBI.
And he said, you have to promise me. You not try to do anything inside. Yeah. Because he said, this is my territory. What Dallas and you do outside in America is not the FBI affair. But if you try to do anything, I said, no. He knows I will meet the president, you know. And there came over with a car and took me straight to the White House. And I remember the small side door, and on the left side was a small elevator to go up to the president's office and the residency.
According to Eric, the president was an elegant man, friendly, who kept straightening his back as if to relieve pain. He was friendly but got to business immediately. He asked, who are the Russians? Where do they have influence?
And he said, well, you're the guy who was recommended me. You tell me about something Khrushchev. Who they are. You could tell me? I said, I think I could.
Allen Dulles, head of the CIA, enjoyed the trust of ex-President Eisenhower and expected the same from Kennedy. He kept reassuring Kennedy that Eric was different than the other Russian experts. Because I learned about the Russians, about communist ideology, by living with them on the inside, he said, unlike the other agents who learned by making deadly mistakes in the field.
You survive because you had to convince the people you are one of them. Every movement, the talk, the body language, everything. How to talk to the higher guy, how to talk to the peasant.
He knew the Russians. He'd rescued his wife from them inside the Soviet Union. He knew the communists. He'd lived as one 3 decades ago in Berlin.
I grew up in a European system extremely rich, highly cultured, highly up in a society. Our household was held up by foreigners. I know many kind of people, you know. I know Russians, I know Slovaks, and we had all the workers in our house, the cooks and everything. But I learned Hungarian because we had relatives in Hungary.
But Eric was not happy with the position that life had granted him.
Somehow I was more for an adventure than just take the life which that class offered me.
To find that adventure, Eric wandered into a working-class section of Berlin. The local bully picked a fight with Eric. It was a short fight. Eric won. After his victory, he noticed a young lady watching him.
So I was interested on her, and I walked up to it, you know. I said, do you have a boyfriend? She said, no. I said, you want one? I said, I am. He said, who are you? I said, well, I'm a poor boy. And who your father? I said, well, my father, I don't know what he do, but... And she said, do he work? I said, no, he don't, because I never see my father work, you know.
Eric's father didn't have to work, but the young Elsa misunderstood and thought that his father was unemployed, like so many others in the city.
One day she said, I know how we could help your father. You know what the Red Front is? I said, no. He said, we help each other. It's a brotherhood.
She never mentioned communism. She did seduce him into delivering messages for the communist underground, where he learned tricks like using hot peeled boiled eggs to open sealed envelopes they carried, and then reseal them when they read the contents. While looking at one of these messages, he read his own death sentence.
One day I had to deliver a message with Elsa. I just opened up the letter myself. I said, I didn't suspect anything against me. And then a letter said, if you think the kid know too much, you grab him and take it to Hamburg, and we ship him to Moscow.
Eric knew what would happen if the communists thought they were being compromised.
It scared me because I was thinking they are watching me. Then I find out I'm in the middle of the cruel murderer gangs. They are gangsters in the name of brotherhood.
It was a violent time. Members of the Red Front were actively terrorizing Germany. He'd seen their influence in Berlin, a city racked with unemployment that erupted into violence as mobs attacked Weimar Republic officials like his father.
The mob was attacking Pujases, who was somebody in the government. My father bring the bunch of soldiers and they put them up in an attic. And one truckload with soldiers run that way with a machine gun, and the other way run the socialists.
As a result of this upheaval, an upstart named Hitler won the chancellorship by promising to restore order. German citizens had traded a global menace for a global madman, but both choices were responses to a failed economy.
The communism was very strong in Germany, extremely. They are almost win. Hitler don't come after the war, Germany would be a Soviet state.
Another advisor quipped when Kennedy asked what he knew about the Russian people. "Mr. President, Jesus Christ was successful because he offered a better life after death. The communists are successful because they offer a better life right now." In short, communism was better than starvation. The spy and the president met throughout the night before Kennedy was convinced that Eric's credentials were real. Even though Kennedy's confidence in the CIA was shattered because of the failed Bay of Pigs invasion in April 1961, Eric became part of Eisenhower's legacy to JFK that proved to be a benefit. During this next meeting, Eric would not only have to further prove himself to JFK, but to the First Lady as well.
One night was very late, and a door opened. The woman came in the room very quietly. I don't know who she is. And I looking at her, little square-faced woman, tiny. She looked at me and listened, she almost curled up beside him. And she said, "Who is that guy?" She said that in French. She said that, "Who's that guy? What he knows, what you don't. Why he listening?" I don't say nothing. I didn't even smile.
Historians argue that Kennedy was terrible with languages. In Paris weeks later, Jacqueline was told that her husband spoke French with a bad Cuban accent. But Kennedy understood his wife's caution and answered her directly that night about Eric.
He said, "Well, it's very important to me because that person," he said in French, is very well informed. And I have to know everything about Khrushchev if I meet him." And the woman said, oh, yes.
It was clear to Eric that the president valued his wife's evaluation of him. It was also clear to Eric that while JFK had selected a wife from within his own wealthy circle, Eric, a German nobleman, had broken every rule in choosing his wife, Sarah. He was betrothed at an early age, not unusual for a German nobleman's son. He was close to his betrothed, Rosa, but he was in love with Sarah. It seemed the president and Eric shared the same European customs.
It's a tradition of the old class. They are let the men stray, because that's what the custom. The man is a man, So she accepted as a tradition, but she wasn't happy about my behavior. Rose was a highly educated. She was fluent Latin, Greek, French, German, Hungarian. Hardly could wait to get married.
As Rosa and Eric's families took holidays together in Budapest, the young couple got to know each other. Eric's mother made it clear that he was to respect Rosa's innocence. Falling in love with Sarah came about in a very different way. Sarah was a Jewess who only narrowly escaped death twice at the hands of the Germans and the Russians. Sarah's father rented property from Eric's grandfather even after the Nuremberg Law was enforced.
When I was younger, I was running around with a motorbike in Berlin. I ran into the young black-haired woman with big eye, nice form, everything. We talk about the impossibility of marriage. She said, "You could marry me, never. The whole world will turn upside down. The whole world will turn upside down, upside down." So she looked around and she said, I'll never be your wife here. And she said, I want to make a love in every room, and you never forget me. Never, ever you go into that room, you will picture me. So I started counting my finger, you know. I said, we have 32 rooms, God's sake.
Jacqueline, Rosa, and Sarah all sacrificed their pride and demonstrated their unconditional love. After listening for some time to Eric, Jacqueline Kennedy left the room to return minutes later with a tray. It bore a tall glass of milk and a large wedge of chocolate cake for Eric. With the Vienna summit coming up in June, now more than ever, Kennedy needed accurate counsel on who were the Russians before he dealt with Nikita Khrushchev. Eric knew who the Russians were and had proved his courage and loyalty to Sarah near the end of the war. The puppet government in Hungary was now run directly by Germany, and the Jews were being ordered up for a labor march to Vienna. Eric, flying for the Luftwaffe, had been shot down and was recuperating in Vienna. He was released from the hospital after treatment and learned from his brother in Budapest that Sarah was headed to Vienna as part of a German labor march.
She believed it's nothing else, just working. They are never heard that famous Auschwitz, she never did. So she believed it. She said, well, if I have to go work, I have to go work. But it's turned out different.
His cool instincts led him to believe that somehow he would connect up with Sarah.
I came out from the dressing station. I was wounded, and there I had the emergency dressing as like a hospital or a clinic for wounded, but mostly for soldiers. So I came here. The reason I find out if any Jews coming from Budapest walking, they will come this way. The people keep saying, the Jew is coming, the Jewish woman coming, the Jew. And I turn around and I recognize Sarah. I recognize her coat, and she had the yellow star. And she looked very sad. I lose my control. I didn't think the Germans, policemen, or anybody around would be surprised I'm as a German officer dressed up, and I run to grab a Jewish woman. I said, Sarah, I'm here. And she looked at me, and what you doing here? And boom, this second the Russian bombers skimming over the sky. And the people run. I grabbed her, put my coat on her, and push her to the other side.
In the confusion, Eric escaped with Sarah. Because he was in uniform, he was able to secure papers and a new identity for Sarah on his word alone. Eric had two women who cared deeply for him, Rosa, his fiancée, and Sarah, his lover. He and Sarah finally reached Berlin, where Rosa worked as a volunteer nurse. Eric had no choice but to ask Rosa to help him save his lover's life.
I said, I have only one way to take Sarah there. And if Rosa throw her out, then I do something else. So I introduced her to Rosa, and she said, well, yes, I will save her. I have to save her life.
Kennedy and Jacqueline understood that courage was one of Eric's strengths, but not his only one. Gathering intelligence was also one of Eric's strengths, and he knew well the value of learning about those one meets in battle. Kennedy thought he was prepared for the battle with Khrushchev, but back pain may have diminished his ability to deal with both the Soviets in Vienna and de Gaulle in Paris. The president refused his doctor's advice to use crutches during his European trip, fearing he would appear sick and weak. De Gaulle described Kennedy as fumbling and overeager. He sought reassurance that the young president understood France's anxiety, sharing a border with Germany, and sharing deep wounds from World War II, which were not fully healed. Eric and the First Lady discuss literature and culture, and these conversations may have prompted Jacqueline to read passages from de Gaulle's memoirs. Passages that JFK memorized and quoted when the two leaders met in Paris before the Vienna summit. Eric noticed the president's back pain had worsened. Acting as a translator in Paris, Eric came to JFK's aid when the First Lady grew weary of formal events and confinement due to JFK's health problems.
He hardly could sit, hardly could walk, and she said to him, Jack, I like to go out to see Paris. I didn't came just here sit in this room. And the guy, he couldn't move. His back hurt so much. And he said, okay, but you have to go with somebody else.
So on the night of June 2nd, while JFK dined quietly at the Quai d'Orsay with several advisors, Eric was charged with protecting Jacqueline as she visited Paris nightclubs and guaranteeing she would remain incognito. Before they left the palace, the president asked Eric, "Do you have a gun?" Eric nodded. Kennedy's trust had grown to the point that he was willing to place Jacqueline's safety in Eric's hands.
We sneak out on a servant door. The French Secret Service had no idea. They would not let it because it was a danger, you know. So one of the guys was named Ken or Keen or something, was very close to the president. He knows it. So he supplies the car, not a fancy limousine or something, the car. And then it was running around. And she was very satisfied.
Eric remembers that Jacqueline drank apple brandy and wore a blonde wig. It was simple. He spoke French, and so did she. They looked like everyone else who drove through the streets and patronized the Paris clubs that night. In 1945, looking like everyone else whose lives were ripped apart at the end of the war, Eric surrendered to the English and Americans. Rosa and Sarah were kidnapped by Russians as spoils of war. Upon his release from Britain and return to Berlin, he found his home occupied by American military brass. His betrothed and girlfriend were gone. For the first time in his life, Eric faced hunger. He needed to find a job or starve.
I was in the right place. After the war, Europe was brought to pieces. Biggest shock I had the first day when I had no food. I tried to deal in a black market, and I was dealing with mostly with the American and English soldiers because they have the goods. I traded foods in refugee camps. Europe survived on a pig grease, pig fat. It was the highest trade value. It was a very important staple. The refugee camps was loaded with people from all over the world. They are coming from the east, running from the Russians. And many of them was rich people who couldn't bring nothing else but the family jewelry, gold, silver, diamonds, whatever it is. And the time came down, the diamonds was worthless because you couldn't eat it. So what I did, I went to Hungary, crossed over the border between Austria and Hungary, and I traded whatever food they had left.
While Eric was trading in the black market, he sensed he was being watched closely, but he didn't know by whom.
I always run into the same person, you know, and he was pretending He don't watch me. Was a well-dressed man, looked like military man, but no ranks. Then he get closer to me, and then we could talk. And I said, you are a police? Because they was controlling the black market. So he said no. And I said, you following me? He said, yes. You speak French? Yeah. You speak Russian? How good? I said, very good. And he said, let's see it. Talk to the Russian soldiers and Russian refugees. So he was amazed because he realized the Russian think I am one of them. And then he said, look, we are SIS officers. How about if you help us? You trade with the Russian, the French, the English, the Americans. You are very capable guy. Look around Berlin. There's nothing here. Whatever you are, we want you to work. He said, we give you security, money, whatever you like. Whatever you like.
Eric's new job as a British SIS intelligence officer and his black market contacts afforded him an inside position as a railroad man at Hungary's Railroad Central. Eric bribed railroad workers and dispatchers, then reported to the SIS. Everything headed to Russia passed through this yard in secret.
The Russian train was running from Austria to Hungary to the Russian border. The Russian always arrived in the night. People don't see what's going on because they was shipping German secrets and POWs and anybody who could use. So I said, this is what the SIS is interesting.
With legal papers calling him a Russian, Eric was put in charge of clearing the station when trainloads from the west passed this checkpoint on their way to Moscow. V-2 rockets, precision machinery, jets, airplanes, stolen art, people, and secret German hardware. He saw all of these headed eastward.
The most significant I find out, they was shipping about 60 highly qualified scientists. I find out who they are. This mostly was who built the Russian MiGs and the atoms and everything. That was a scientist. And then I organized the railroad people to sending my message. But they was think I'm in a black market. When I send the message, I told them what I need trading goods. So I get everything. It came from England or America, whatever I wanted. Watches, gold rings, chocolates, tea, coffee, cocoa, stocking, anything I want. And the railroads was amazing. They was think I'm a king of the black market.
Eric tracked Russia's military buildup, including scientists captured and transported east to work on the Soviet atomic bomb program, troops being moved west to fortify borders, and Russian intelligence agents who infiltrated both American and British governments. In perpetual danger, Eric worked under fire and lived with tension that would unravel most men. Kennedy was now faced with meeting the Russian bear, Premier Nikita Khrushchev. The Vienna summit would prove crucial in helping the young president size up his opponent, who intended to size up America's new leader. Eric faced just as formidable an opponent by daring to believe he could rescue Rosa and Sarah from deep inside Russia.
I was working in refugee camps, and I find out that they are probably alive and in Russia. I couldn't search for them right away because I had to establish myself as a Russian.
This was the first time Eric entered Russia, a test to prove his ability to the British SIS that had recruited him in Budapest.
Months and months preparation, I'm finally arrived in Moscow, and that was in a Sunday morning. I belonged to the railroad people, so I had pretty good papers. I assimilated in a hurry. Red flags and hammers and everything everywhere, and everywhere is police. And I see big billboards pointing at you, pointing at anybody. Your duty is report any suspicious person. Watch out for the Western agents. Then I made my contact when I arrived. It really was the English embassy. And the signal I had to give, I walked like this, and I put my hat under my arm, put my hat, and 3 times I put it back like this, and took it off again. Then they know I'm arrived. The embassy was equipped. They had big telescope watching the Russian everything, and the Russian other side watched them. So they are looking each other eyeball.
Kennedy knew what went on inside the embassies. His family had lived in the American embassy in London 15 years earlier. He'd been exposed to the European culture and customs, just as Eric had been exposed to the culture and customs of the Russians.
I came just as a pathfinder, and then I pick up all the customs, I became a perfect Moscovita.
Eric worked his way into a position as an assistant chief prosecutor by volunteering in the Communist Party. The Russian prosecutor's job was to hand out death sentences to enemies of the state in trials held throughout the Soviet Union.
One day, to the district attorney I worked, he had the job in where there was a big prison camp, and the prisoners and the Russians worked together in a coal mine. It was a big, cold, mean weather, big snow. Nobody moved around much. I didn't find her boom just like this, because it was many different camps. It was spread all over. I was searching camps, and finally a Russian guard, he said, in that camp is German doctors, women doctors. So we get closer, and the Russian pointed me to the building. I open a door, and then stand Sarah in a fairly clean white smock. And then she just, I had the heavy Russian hat, fur hat, and I wasn't shaved. I didn't know what to say. I called her name, Sarah. And she said, you again come to help, come to save? And she said, how many times you will save me? And then I said, where is Rosa? And she started crying. She said, I don't want to tell you. I'd rather die before I tell you what's happened. I said, what? She said, Rosa died. She said she was weak and not enough food and no medicine. So she died. So I came here, saved 2. I said, I saved 1.
Eric had no choice but to leave Sarah in the camp and return to Moscow with the prosecutor. But he left important papers behind to establish an alibi for a return trip. His plan included a deal with a railroad engineer to wait in the rail yard for Eric and Sarah to escape. Weeks later, he returned to the camp from Moscow, pretending to retrieve the papers. He borrowed a car from a fellow Russian officer at the camp, disguised Sarah as a man, and sneaked her out of the camp. They made their way to the railroad yard, barely averting capture. The engineer faked mechanical problems, which allowed Eric time to get Sarah on the train and fool his Russian pursuers.
When I arrived, you see, the Russians didn't know who they are chasing. I drive here, and I pushed her out. And that guy, I think it was Joseph or something, grabbed her, and the train was almost moving. So he grabbed her, pulled it up, and I twist the car, the wheel, and I jump out and let the car roll itself. And the car turned and went to a couple of tracks and hit the picket fence. Then the Russian patrol car. I standing there and a Russian came like we stopped asking somebody, did you see your car? Did you see something? Yeah. What? I said, yes, that car is right there. And the car was wobbling without driver, And the train was pulling out. From the beginning, when I left the camp, I gambled. I know is we succeed or we dead, both of us. She was shaking, could drink, could eat, just. So we hid her under blankets, and we was pulling out that city, Dnipropetrovsk, and we ran miles and miles and miles. And I said, look, it's safe. And she said, now you want to marry me or what? And the wrecks and everything on a station, we pulled in other stations. And she said, you know what? It look like the whole world is upside down. And she said, I told you, if you ever married me, the world will be upside down. And this was upside down.
On October 25th, Eric was secreted into the White House to talk about the Russians again during the height of the standoff with Khrushchev. For 3 days, October 25th through the 27th, while sequestered in the White House, Eric would undergo an enormous moral dilemma, a dilemma of loyalty versus revenge. Revenge expressed as a question. Should he simply stand back and allow the nations who destroyed his homeland to destroy themselves?
The president, he trusted me. He trusted me to avoid what's coming. That's my job. I considered both nations my enemy. It was, the Americans ruined my country, ruined my city. They are bomb my house. They are kill my people terribly way in discriminating bombing. And the Russian take off my wealth. I said, why don't you just let them to slug it out? I'm sure one thing, he had at least 40 advisors. They was pushing him to make the first move. They have said, we destroy the Russian and destroy the capability to hit us. And the president was asking them, you sure? I was in another room. I heard what was going on. I came out and he was trembling. He was trembling and white. And that's when I said, please, don't be hurry. Talk to the Russian. Go to the Russian embassy. He said, why? Why the Russian will not attack? I said, I tell you why. And take my words. If the war will erupt in a few seconds, communist Russia not exist anymore. You wiped out the communism. And I looked at the terrified faces of the two guys, just like a lighting. I don't know why, because I'm not a Bible man. And I see it, blessed as a peacemaker. And I said, God's sake, I am. The God put me in that position. I'm consider myself a peacemaker. A direct line from Moscow ring. And he said, Alex, that was my name, Alex, is Moscow. And I picked up the phone in a hurry, and the Russian voice, he said, is a direct call from Tovarish Nikita Alexander Khrushchev. He said in Russian, he said, like he talking to the president, and he said, Mr. President, we don't want war. Please, we don't want any war. Let's deal. He said, I'm only thing want you to do, don't attack Cuba. I don't want the war. I think Bobby heard the conversation, and he ran, and he lifted up his arm, and he said, God bless God, we have no war, no war, no war. And boom, he collapsed. He collapsed, and I remember his white eye, I see just his white. I heard Khrushchev talking now on the phone, and he said, one more deal. You have too much advantage over us. Your missiles are in Afghanistan and Turkey and everywhere. He said, I want you to pull it back. And he said, it's our secret. You swear to it. And the president said, it's a deal, it's a deal. Yes, yes, I promise. I was the only guy who knows what Khrushchev offered. I swear the president kneeled down and he prayed with a rosary.
During that moment, when the clock struck 13, time and sanity were suspended together. Somehow, time had skipped over the violence in 1962, but not, it seems, altogether. Years later, Eric finally reveals the source of his confidence. I knew they didn't want war. I had a KGB defector in my pocket, and I knew I could use some blessing. Events just before and after those 13 days of crisis, like the Bay of Pigs and assassination attempts in other communist countries, may have set the stage for JFK's own assassination 13 months later. Sarah and Eric were in Berlin when they heard that the president had been killed. Ironically, Eric had survived. Information that human intelligence operatives, like Eric, uncover preserves the truth of history that lives between the lines. But at what personal cost to those who are the stewards of that intelligence?
I see it blessed as a peacemaker. And I said, God's sake, I am. The God put me in that position. I'm consider myself a peacemaker.
On his way home from the brutal Vienna trip, a reflective JFK scribbled this quote from Abraham Lincoln: I know there is a God, and I see the storm coming. If he has a place for me, I believe I am ready. It seems on that grim October night, God made ready two men from opposite sides of the world who somehow came together to fulfill their destinies.